Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. The Union Environment Ministry has come up with a draft of a new forest policy that focuses on climate change mitigation and reducing threats like wildfires, encroachment and man-animal conflict. The draft National Forest Policy 2018, which aims to replace a 30-year-old forest policy, tends to address issues that have emerged over a period of time, including increasing public-private partnerships. Pointing out to the continuously declining investments in the sector, the draft also touches upon the lack of a pan-country reliable and compatible data in the forestry sector, which it says are the challenges facing the forest management in the country. The draft dated March 14th invited comments and suggestions from all stakeholders in a month. In our first segment of Policy Watch, we will analyze the draft of the new National Forest Policy. Joining me on the program today are Chetan Chauhan, Deputy National Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and Professor C.K. Varshney, Environmentalist. Professor, I'd like to begin with you, of course. Why do we need a new National Forest Policy? Let's first understand that.
You see, forest is a very dynamic ecosystem. And you know, climate change is a factor which is changing the character as well as composition of the forest. And secondly, our requirement and our dependence of forest is also, this equation is also changing because of the population pressure, because of the other pressures that we have in terms of developmental issues, opening up the roads and developmental projects. So I think all this resulted into a series of issues which were being faced by people in different places. For example, you have mentioned about the man-animal conflict. They have risen very dramatically. And secondly, there has been a large number of forest fire of late. In fact, the frequency has gone up, both in terms of number of incidences as well as the size and area that they cover.
Several people lost their lives in Tamil Nadu as well
recently. And this was most recent.
Yes.
And secondly, that our issue of the water conservation has become very critical. Either there are floods or there are droughts, and summer discharge is really depleting. In fact, in many streams are not there, and the ones which were very, very dependable streams have only dried up. So I think these are the issues which have become very serious. You already know that because of the climate change, the apple belt is shifting, and many other, the area of the species as well as their number is also shifting. So I think there are a number of issues. And then the question of carbon sequestration, because this is the only place where with minimum investment you can effectively do carbon sequestration, provided we really manage the forest well and according to the requirement and the scientific method.
Sure. Chetan Chauhan, what shape do you see this new National Forest Policy taking eventually?
No, I think that this policy will come into being because of the last 30 years, we had one policy, sadly, whose most of the frameworks and recommendations were not implemented fully. So the biggest challenge of this policy is whether the government will be able to implement the provisions of the draft policy when it becomes a final policy. But because resources is a huge problem in forest management, even the wildlife management. And the central government funding for forestry and wildlife, for environment as such has not risen as it has risen for maybe for infrastructure, for economic development. So in that percentage terms, the money has not risen. And if you compare the state budgets, it has dramatically remained at the same level or increased by a meager 2%, 3%, 4% every year. Though the governments are earning a lot from the forest, the giving back to the forest is very less, which this policy also talks about. But I think one good thing about this policy is implementation is the National Forestry Board, which is recommending at the central level and the state level, the State Forestry Board. If this board is constituted and it has its meeting at the regular intervals, and the systems and the frameworks which they are talking about in this policy, if they are implemented, it can bring a huge change. One major thing which is reiterated from the old policy is 33% of the India's geographical area should be forest. I think it is a very difficult task.
It is a difficult task because the population is only increasing.
The population is rising, the pressure on the forest resources is increasing. If you see the latest Forest Survey of India report, though the government claimed that the forest cover has increased, I say the green cover has increased. The real forest cover has gone down. The quality of forest have gone down. So in the last 20-30 years since the last policy came in, not much has been done to protect the forest, to ensure the forest.
Sure.
One important factor in this is, apart from wildlife, is having a special section for Northeast. Northeast, 80-90% of the geographical area in many of the states is forest. And because of the shifting cultivation, encroachment, the depletion is high. So you have to protect your northeastern forest because they are the biggest resource.
Right.
Another area, the tribal areas of India, which has the richest forest resource and richest mineral resource. This policy talks about it, but how to implement a balance between mining and forest resources management is an issue. This policy also talks about one crucial area is forest produce management. Forest produce management has been controversial because under the Forest Rights Act, the tribals had been given to right to procure the forest produce, but the forest departments are not very keen on this.
Right.
So how to improve livelihood of people who are living in and around forest is extremely crucial to ensure that this policy we can see some sort of implementation.
Indeed.
100% I think will be a very difficult thing. If we achieve 30 to 40% of the policy achievement, it will be a great thing.
You know, Professor, what do you see as the biggest challenges and how do we tackle these challenges going forward?
I think the challenge remains. First of all, this policy has shifted, as Chetan has said, from the forest to the tree cover. And I think we should distinguish between the two. And it is good that we cannot maintain the forest as desired 33%, but at the same time it is important to distinguish between the two. And that should be the strength of the policy. That admitting that these are different, because these two things cannot give you the same services, ecosystem services, which a forest is able to give. The second important thing is that most of the emphasis on commercialization and utilization of the wood. Now here I have to say that the communities which really are in the forest, tribal communities, are going to suffer because most of their livelihood depends, day-to-day earning depends on non-forest timber produce. And since we are now emphasizing only on timber species, and therefore their number is going to go down. First because of the natural death of the trees, and secondly because of the thrust on this kind of plantation. So I think the conflict is going to be intensify. And you know, for any policy you require cooperation of the people on the ground, and these are the people who need to be supported. And to be very frank, ecologically speaking, world over it has been proved time and again that forests are far more important and rewarding in terms of non-timber forest produce rather than the price of the timber. Right. So I think this policy has taken into cognizance the climate change issue, but only partially.
Okay.
It is only from the point of view of carbon sequestration, but that is not enough. What is more important is that there has to be a very concerted effect and a clear statement as to find out the changes which the climate change is bringing about to the composition and to the structure of our forest, and
Sure.
and how does it affect their functionality. So I think this is an important aspect which to my mind ought to have been there when we talk of climate change, because sequestration through tree growing is a very important aspect, but a very limited aspect.
Sure.
But I think forests are capable of doing much more than that. So I think this is something that we have to. The third thing which I feel has to be there is that they are talking of water cycle or recirculation of the water, recycling of the water, and I don't think that forests are capable of. So I think certain amount of technical changes and rejuggling of the terms is also required to provide the message clear.
Okay.
And also with a focus.
Focus and a clear message going forward is the key.
And I think one more point I would like. I think forest certification has been introduced, which to my mind is very important.
Okay.
So that the illegal forest trade as well as cutting of the timber can be stopped.
Okay, all right. You know, Chetan, Chauhan, how is this new draft policy or the new policy that we will see going to be different from the 30-year-old existing policy?
There are many changes, as the Professor Saab said. The climate change is an important aspect. Certification is the important aspect. The forestry management plans for each forest is an important aspect. Digitizations of forest boundaries is something new, which has not been spoken earlier. The focus on tribal areas in the northeast is something different we are visualizing in this policy. And one big change is this policy speaks a lot about economic use of timber, which can be very dangerous, as you said, but this is a new aspect. And how the government will balance between maintaining the tree cover or the forest cover and exploitation of trees for economic purpose, that has to be seen, because the policy does not clearly say how that balance will be achieved, how the companies will be allowed to harvest trees and ensure that the new forests also come up in that area. Because if you go by the compensatory forestation, even the CAG report had pointed out, even 50 to 60% of compensatory forestation, which is for the industries, have not been done. So India's track record on compensatory forestation is extremely bad, though this policy speaks about it, but it does not tell us how they will monitor the economic use of forest, that the forests are not destroyed, they are replenished adequately. So I think the monitoring aspect is very important, though ICFRI, they are saying that they will be strengthened, the technical institutes for Forest Survey of India, they will be strengthened. So there is a lot of hope in the policy, but I think the challenges are much big. When the final policy draft comes, sure, I think many of these issues will be sorted out.
Okay, all right. Quick closing comment from you, Professor, before I let you go, on what final shape do you see the policy taking?
I think the policy is important because it really takes into account some of the important aspects. But I think that clearly creating new structures or institution is not going to really be very beneficial for implementing this policy. What is more important is that how we engage the local people in maintaining the forest, which is not very clear. Take for example Northeast. Northeast is a special case because most of the forest is in private forest, and therefore there is a mosaic of private forest, and therefore involving them in their forest conservation becomes very important. And for that, what are the new innovative ways that they are going to have?
Right.
Because GFM has failed in many places, but it has also succeeded in some, but it has a lot of, I should say, hiccups. So I think on those aspects, the policy should have been little more clear and more straightforward.
All right, Chetan?
No, I think I agree with Professor Saab, but you know, I think we have to look at one aspect very important, which I feel missing. The Forest Right Act is also about forest. It is about communities who are living in the forest. So this forest policy should have synergized the Forest Right Act with the Indian Forest Act and the Forest Environment Conservation, Wildlife Conservation Act. So some sort of a synergy between these laws should have been visible in this draft, which I think I have not seen here. And second is, it speaks about water degradation, but the captive areas in Himalayas, which are rich forest, which have seen a huge degradation in Himachal, in Uttarakhand, and even in Northeast because of big hydro projects, development. These issues have not been addressed. How the captive areas of India's big rivers will be maintained.
Okay.
So that aspect of I think is missing in this policy.
Right.
And
all right.
Thirdly, which is very important, is that the give back, how the people, how the companies will give back to the forest of what they earn from the forest is not clear in the policy.
All right.
So the clarity aspect of the policy, they have a lot of good things, they have addressed almost every issue, but clarity and how it will be implemented is not very clear in the policy.
Okay, on that note then I'll have to take a short break. Chetan Chauhan, stay with us. Professor, thank you so much for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. It's time for a short break now. On the other side, we'll discuss about the Union government's plans for regulatory framework for social media and online content. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Policy Watch with me, Frank Pereira. The government is planning to put in place a regulatory framework for social media and online content. Speaking at a summit organized by a private news channel in the capital last week, the Information and Broadcasting Minister said that the current legislation is not clear with regards to online news and broadcast content material. The Press Council of India, which is a statutory body, governs the conduct of the print media in the country. Similarly, for television news, there is the News Broadcasters Association, but there is no such body for social media and online content. The ministry is in talks with the concerned stakeholders on the issue. According to the minister, the recent consolidation of 3 media units under the Bureau of Outreach Communication was the need of the hour, and doing away with such silos was the only option left. In our next segment, we will analyze the importance of legislation for social media and online news. Still with me on the program is Chetan Chauhan, Deputy National Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and joining us is Virag Gupta, cyber law expert and senior advocate. Thank you to both my guests for joining me here on Policy Watch. Virag Gupta, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What is the present regulatory framework that we have in place as far as the social media and online content is concerned?
I don't think that there is any regulatory framework for the social media or online content, and even it has not been properly or legally defined. Even e-commerce has not been properly defined, so there is no such definition of the social media online content or the news, and this is an emerging field, and our old Information Technology Act is not properly equipped to handle all these type of things. So I think that any legislation or regulation has to be since beginning only that we have to define the social media, then we have to define what type of news content is there, then online content, if it is the personal sharing, can it be treated as the news? So many challenges are there, and the biggest challenge is section 79 of the IT Act, which defines that there is no liability of the intermediary and all such websites are treated as the intermediary. So if you have any regulation, to whom you can enforce, that is the I think biggest question.
Sure. Chetan, Chauhan, as far as online content and social media is concerned, Virag Gupta has just pointed out a few challenges, saying that it's difficult. How easy or difficult is it really to regulate online content and the social media?
It will be very difficult for the government to regulate online media unless you have a process of self-regulation. The government, the minister said about the law, I don't know whether it will be law or regulations, because in case of television, the government tried to bring in a broadcast law. In 1998-99, they proposed a broadcast law, which was again pushed in 2004-05, but all the television companies opposed it, after which there was a birth of NBA. So self-regulation is one of the finest ways to regulate social media. Though Twitter, Facebook and other mediums have policies for self-regulation, but they are not very enforceable. And it is very periodic that you will see some Twitter handle been this thing or some action been taken. So the government, I think, should come out with a clear-cut guidelines on self-regulation of all the websites. If you see in India, like print media, all the newspapers have to be registered with the government. Television channels have to take permission from the INB ministry. For an online content, you can start your website anytime and you can write anything, nothing will happen to you.
And with barely any investment.
Barely with any investment, but there is no accountability. You have to bring some sort of an accountability to the websites, and for that I think there should be an amendment in the RNI Act, or there should be a law in which the registration with one agency should be made mandatory. Like for television, there are provisions in the downlinking guidelines that their certification can be cancelled. This thing can also be cancelled, and the government can have a power to suspend an online website or news portal if they don't adhere to the self-certification process. But I think instead of the government bringing a law enforcing something from the top, my thing is that it should be a self-regulatory mechanism, which the government should ask all the companies, all the social media agencies to enforce it strictly, and there can be an NBA sort of a body, which is a body of all the online content creators, which can adjudicate in case of a complaint, which can enforce if there is somebody is complaining, because the dangers of social media can be gauged from the fact a large number of rights in this country is happening only because of social media.
I can see Virag Gupta shaking his head in disagreement. He does not believe that self-regulation is the right way forward. Go ahead. I want to hear your views.
On the first part, I fully agree. Now, in the new age of internet, there are challenges before the regulators. Let us, in the previous program, I spoken about the TRAI. Now, TRAI can regulate the telecom companies, but TRAI can't regulate the WhatsApp. So, WhatsApp is still operational because they are not getting any favor from you. They are not dependent for anything from you. So, how can you regulate them? The same thing happen in the media also. Television channel requires some sort of license, some sort of interconnectivity, WhatsApp maybe. Any newspaper requires registration, and without that they can't run. But online content, these digital content, they don't require Government of India any permission. So that's why you can't regulate them.
So how do we fix accountability?
Number two, the same thing is that we should not expect any self-regulation from them also. So
how do we fix accountability then?
So this I raised in 2012 before Delhi High Court, and I argued. I said that like any newspaper, there are editors. So for any website, there should be some responsibility of the editor. like editor, that he should be responsible for the content. But online content, nobody would like to be editor and nobody would like to have the responsibility of the editor. And for editorial responsibility, you need to change the section 79, which is based on the international law. So, idea of making the regulation for the online content is good. Now, there are three type of contents, online content. Number one is you have these digital news channels or digital news websites. Number two is the search engine which are working as the news. We may have seen the Google itself has become the news. And third are the other content, miscellaneous contents, which are the exchange of thoughts, which are, we tell them, online content, somebody individually sharing. So, first type of digital news websites, you can control them because they are working for some newspaper or some Indian companies. But for other two, I feel so that we don't have presently any regulatory mechanism, and in the internet it is almost difficult and impossible to control them.
Okay. So, what are the dangers then, Chetan Chauhan, of online content and the social media?
The dangers visible in this country, the amount of hatred, the amount of venom which is being spread through social media and media content. And if you see riots in this country, it may be in Uttar Pradesh, maybe in Rajasthan, maybe in recent one in area, where the social media has played extremely important role. Fake news is the biggest annoyer these days. The fake news spreads even faster than news, and fake news has a potential to create a lot of issues among communities, because most of the fake news is creating some sort of a disharmony between communities, caste or creed, and it can create tension. If you see in the last couple of years, the number of times the governments have to suspend the internet connection in even small towns, in small villages, in districts is enormous. You will not get a data because it is thousands of times the government has enforced suspension of internet. This is because internet has become a new challenge for the law enforcing agencies to maintain some law and order. So, I think then the government needs to step in. They have to regulate in some way. Self-regulation is one way. Making registration of a large number of websites is some way, because only a few websites government can regulate which are run by the media organizations. Maybe like top media organization running a website, if the content is not proper, you can call up the editor or the editor can be called. But a large number of small websites which are running parallelly, which have no accountability, you cannot have that sort of accountability unless you get them registered with some agency. Like for all newspapers, it doesn't take much. If I want to start a newspaper, I have to apply. I will get the newspaper masthead within few days, and the approval comes, and the approval comes through the district magistrate. So, this sort of a process can be there. Like if somebody is opening a new website in maybe in Lucknow, so he sends the approval, the district magistrate certify, yes, this guy's office is there, he's functional, and this is the it can be opened. So, some sort of regulation has to be there. Even the companies like WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, they are international companies. If some sort of self-certification, the government initiates a dialogue with them, and this self-regulation mechanism is there, I think these companies will agree.
Okay.
But we have to make a start. It can't be, because internet is such a wide open space and we cannot regulate it in some way, cannot be the argument. I think the minister's call for regulation, she said law, I think the law may not be proper, but the initiative is a good initiative because we need some sort of regulation.
Right, Virag Gupta.
I fully endorse the minister's statement, but again 4 points which Chetan has said. Number one, regarding hatred and everything, there was a law of 66A which Supreme Court scrapped, and for last many years government, because there of the conflict of the freedom of expression, everything, and it is matching with the IPC, but still we are not able to make a new law in substituting the 66A. So, it is difficult to regulate the social media and internet. Secondly, when we are talking about the collector's permission for the newspaper or print, now the problem with the internet doesn't come in the state purview, it directly comes with the central government purview only, and only particular department can take the action. So, can we expect a registration from the Google or Facebook or Twitter? We suggested 2 things for that as per the Make in India. Number one, they should establish their main office in India. Number two, they should establish their servers in India so that we can regulate them. Now, the thirdly, when we are talking about controlling any of the content, we have to understand that whether this is the news website or this is a miscellaneous content. I don't think that miscellaneous content can be regulated in any manner, and for the news, we have the 2 different things. Number one, government is providing advertisements to them. Number two, We have to see whether any website working or operational India, whether we should have such provisions that each and every website which is operational India should be registered in India. That mechanism, I think, should be done, but it cannot be done only for the media or the news content purposes.
Sure. Sure. Okay,
No,
quick closing comment from you, Chetan, Chauhan.
if you
No,
see
with the way forward, what needs to be done? Now, the
one example of-
challenges galore.
One
Government is
example I will give.
mulling a legislation. What should the legislation entail?
I think legislation will entail registration, some of the steps that all the foreign companies should be accountable to the Indian system, and self-regulation should be there. I don't think that the government should become sort of a regulator and say they remove this content or remove that content. It should be a self-regulatory mechanism. If the government wants to intervene, it can ask that committee to look into this and take some action within 48 hours or 72 hours or whatever the period the government decides. And then the self-regulatory committee can decide on whether the content has to be removed or not. And the self-regulatory committee can be a body of experts from a legal profession, from social media, from journalists. It can be a combination of all. But Social Media Election Commission has a social media cell, and they have been able to regulate social media during election period in the election bound state to some level. They have made an initiative. They have done to some extent. I think if the election commission example is taken and is taken forward at the national level, some initiative can be taken on that.
Okay, the challenge is galore, but a start needs to be made somewhere, and that's how we can take this issue forward. And let's hope something concrete comes out of it. Virag Gupta, I know you want to have a final say, but okay. Well,
IT intermediate rules talk about the grievance officer, which the Delhi High Court has ordered. Grievance officer may be treated as the editor, and that provision can immediately be enforced without making any change in law.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Policy Watch. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. You can share your feedback and suggestions with us as well. The email ID is policywatch.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha Television. That's it from me. See you again next time.